Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Adventures in Brain Injury podcast. So I had this conversation with Nora Gedgaudas, and we didn't really we weren't planning on talking about neurofeedback, but that's where it went. And then it went into nutrition and all sorts of other things. I mean, her and I can talk for hours. So check out this episode. She was a neurofeedback practitioner for years. And she is now doing a whole lot more with nutrition, which is the building blocks, which is why I wrote How to Feed a Brain, because those are the building blocks. But when we get the building blocks, now we want to reinforce the pathways that we want to build. We want to build the bridges that we want to build. So that's what this podcast is about. It's about a lot of things, but that's a huge piece of it, is neurofeedback. So I want to thank everybody who's left a review. I truly appreciate it. You guys are making a difference in how many people hear this podcast, and that affects people's lives. I mean, people reach out to me daily telling me how this affects their life. And I appreciate you all leaving your comments, your reviews, all of it. It's just so appreciated. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if it wasn't for each and every one of you. So thank you so much. I am also working with clients, and most of them have a loved one in a compromised situation, in a medical crisis of sorts. And I am working with them and their medical team and helping them to navigate the windy roads of recovery, especially in a hospital setting. We can get around the standard of care. We can get the treatments we choose. And I have a 100% success rate coaching my clients on how that's done and partnering with them to walk through this difficult situation with them. So if you're in a situation like that, I mean, I also work with clients who are no longer in a critical situation and who are recovering or going beyond and are looking to just optimize their brain health. So if you want to work with me, send me an email, consult@feedabrain.com, and let me know that you're interested, and we will set up a conversation. Or you can go to feedabrain.com/consult, and it will take you right to the questionnaire where you can fill that out and schedule a call with me. So, without further ado, you guys need to hear what Nora Gedgaudas has to say. This was a great episode, and I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. Nora, so good to speak with you again. Always is, always such a pleasure. So much respect and love, and just adoration for who you are and your work.
Oh, thank you so much, Kevin. It's it's always a pleasure having any opportunity to talk with you, and whether it's socially or whether it's something like this, it's always good.
Cool. Yeah. So first, I wanted to just address let's talk a little bit about your background. You were studying to be a physician.
Yeah, at one point along the line, I found it it was a less than passionate choice that I made to do that, but it was a logical choice given my family background. It would have been an easy ride for me, through that whole process because of who my father was, and I have other physicians in my family. But I didn't
So
find
your
myself.
father was a physician?
My father was a world famous within the field of radiology.
Mm-hmm.
He was the guy actually responsible for bringing full body CAT scan and MRI to this country. Quite a long time ago, it kind of put him on the map. He was on television quite a bit during that time, and he was professor emeritus. He was head of the radiology department at the University of Minnesota Medical Hospital for many, many years, and president of the Rankin Ray Society, and all of these things. Within his genre, he was a going concern. And because he was sort of medical royalty, if you were, then because of that, it would have opened a lot of doors for me. It would have made it pretty easy, I think, for me to write my own ticket in medicine if that was the route that I chose to take. But the fact is that it really was not allopathic. The allopathic model of medical treatment just ultimately wasn't that inspiring to me. So it led me off in a lot of different directions to really find my way to where I am now, which feels a lot more right for me.
So let's.
I've spent a better part of I actually have spent in excess of the last 20 years actually specialized in working with the brain using a modality called neurofeedback, which I'm sure by now your audience is probably somewhat familiar with. And I ran a highly successful private practice here in Portland, Oregon, and also combining that with nutritional therapy, functional nutritional principles. I'm pretty knowledgeable about functional medicine as well. And combining nutritional therapy and foundational nutritional principles associated with optimized brain health, and combining that with brain training, like using very cutting edge neurofeedback technologies. To me, it was an almost foolproof combination for, radical improvements in not just cognitive function, but in anything related to dysregulation that may be associated with the brain and central nervous system. And there are very few things that aren't associated with those things. So it was a very powerful combination for me for a great deal of time. And once I became better known for what it is that I do within the nutritional genre, it became two very full-time jobs for me. And I now, basically I'm not taking new neurofeedback clients at this stage of the game. I'm focused largely on addressing foundational and functional principles in both physical and also brain health, which is, obviously the brain is generally screwed on to most people's bodies. So I don't necessarily separate those things up, but a lot of people do. They say mind, body, and spirit as if there were three different things. Well, no, it's the mind and body are generally, the same part of the same functioning or dysfunctioning system, as it were. And I have found that the fastest route to improvements in outcome with respect to neurofeedback approaches far and away involved applying a lot of these, foundational functional principles in nutrition. And to me, it's the only rational starting place to radically improve function, even though neurofeedback in and of itself can be extremely powerful. But I found that in persons who, who only wanted to do neurofeedback and really weren't willing to address the other stuff, although sometimes it was disconcertingly effective, but ultimately people were going to get the best results if they did both, right? And so I feel that there are plenty of ways in which nutrition can be foundational to neurofeedback and not the other way around, although neurofeedback certainly can improve the efficiency with which a brain is going to utilize nutrients, and it can help provide stability and a little robustness to functioning, but it's got to have raw materials in order to work with. and it also needs to be able to function without the interference of certain substances that are more likely to compromise than support your best brain health. So by starting there, I find I'm actually able to effectively serve a much wider population. And so that's where most of my focus is now, is in writing, speaking, researching, educating around these subjects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And yeah, TBI was definitely a big chunk of what I did as a neurofeedback provider.
Right. Yeah, and that's exactly right. And why my first book is How to Feed a Brain, because we need the raw materials, we need the supplies. The analogy I use, many connections in my brain have been damaged. And I think of rebuilding those connections like building a bridge. Mm-hmm. What do you need to build a bridge? You need supplies and you need skilled workers.
Right.
Supplies would be the nutrition, the brain building nutrition. You'd also need to get the supplies to the construction site, and that's digestion.
Sure.
We need to make sure we're actually delivering the nutrients to the brain. And then skilled workers, that would be the therapy, the targeted therapy, the neurofeedback, all of that. And so we've actually only done one episode on neurofeedback on the Adventures in Brain Injury podcast. So let's talk about that.
Shame on you. I mean, really.
Tell me more.
I actually think of neurofeedback as perhaps the single most effective intervention that can be brought in to improve brain function in a person compromised by traumatic brain injury and a closed head injury. I'm sure you're well aware of the fact that conventional, CAT scans and MRI, with all due respect to my dearly departed father, cannot, by and large, tell the difference between a living brain and a dead one. These conventional mainstream medical neurology approaches basically use those kinds of imaging techniques in order to seek out a particular lesion that they expect to find. And as we know, the lesions aren't always there. They're not always easy to identify.
Visible, yeah. And let's also keep in mind that there are 86 billion neurons in your brain, making trillions of connections, right? And so, there are less than 8 billion people on this planet. To put that in perspective, 86 billion in your brain.
The number varies depending on who you talk to, and 10 times that number of glial cells, which is your immune system, right? And that comes into play enormously in this equation, because really that inflammatory response is initiated by those types of brain cells, which really it's sort of interesting, because the newest generation of neurofeedback training, and really the form that I most strongly endorse and subscribe to, has to do with infralow frequency training, which actually involves training the brain on that glial level. And we've actually found, over time, that we've gravitated to those frequency ranges, which can be, 10,000th of a hertz and below. We're actually appealing to those networks, which have a kind of a central governing principle with respect to driving, the health and functioning of the brain.
So you kind of lost me on the frequencies. What are the frequencies?
Well, so with neurofeedback, there are electrode sensors that are placed in whatever configuration makes sense on your head, relative to usually the symptoms that a person walks in with. We know that different areas of the brain are semi-localized in some fashion at different types of functioning. And by a person sitting there and telling me what kinds of symptoms they're experiencing, I generally get a pretty good sense of what networks in the brain are going to need to be addressed and exercised in order to get better functionality there. So, but we're not just placing electrodes over those sites in particular, we're also addressing the communication between different areas and networks in the brain in our placements. It's called the montage, in the way that the electrodes are actually placed upon the brain. And
so are these electrodes emitting frequencies?
No.
They're
so
sensors.
What happens is that they're sensors. So what they do, you place those on the scalp in whatever configuration or montage that may be appropriate to a person's given symptoms, issues, goals, whatever. The wires from that go into an amplifier that then amplify that signal, and everything moves in only one direction, right? Even if I wanted to make you dance, I couldn't do it. And that signal then amplifies the electrical signal, the comparatively weak electrical signal coming out of the brain, and displays that on the therapist's screen as the raw EEG and some other pertinent information that's useful to know. Then the practitioner then sets goals for the brain. And it just basically says, okay, hang out here at this particular, exercise your brain within certain frequency range for a period of time, and have these areas of your brain exercise within a certain frequency range for a certain period of time. And we hear about beta, alpha, theta, delta waves, which is sort of the old-fashioned way of looking at this. And when I first started out, that's what we talked about. But that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about infralow frequency ranges that can't be categorized in that same exact way.
What kind of frequency ranges?
Infralow frequency ranges.
Infralow, like super
infralow,
low.
like super, super, super low.
Lower than low.
Lower than, so beta, alpha, theta, delta. So maybe a way of putting this, if you're in a boat on the ocean, in a little rowboat or something. I've actually had this experience in a kayak out on Lake Superior. You have, the little waves that are kind of lapping up, or maybe big waves that are lapping up against the boat, right? And the bigger the waves, the more destabilized the boat becomes, right? So we know theta and delta waves, which are very high, whatever, have a tendency to, to kind of rollick things around, which is, there are good and bad brain waves in all of these frequency ranges, good and bad alpha, good and bad beta, good and bad theta, good and bad delta, to be had. But we're just offering a general analogy here. So the little waves lapping up against the boat, you can look upon as the conventional types of brain waves, right? They offer certain waveforms at certain, intervals per second or whatever of frequency. And, generally speaking, your delta waves are, 1 to 3 hertz, and thetas in sort of the 4 to 7 hertz range, alpha 8 to 11 hertz, and beta, generally speaking, above that into about maybe 22 hertz of range. And then you have the gamma levels, which are these bursts of, very high frequency activity in the 40 hertz plus range that have some interesting effects that are being explored, etc. But below that, okay, so above 40 hertz, we're not really talking about beta, alpha, theta, delta, we're talking about arousal levels. Above 40 hertz, we're not really talking arousal. We're talking about brain processing speeds, and which is something quite different. In the infralow ranges, I liken those when you're sitting in that boat on a large body of water, like one of the Great Lakes or the ocean. There are the little waves lapping up against the boat, but then there are these large swells that come along underneath all of that are actually driving the currents and, forming kind of the scaffolding on which these other brain waves occur. And infralow basically would be the equivalent of those enormous swells underneath it all that are really kind of driving, in a manner of speaking, provide an important underlying mechanism for how the brain actually manages its own function at the most fundamental level. And we have found over time that training in those frequency ranges, even though it's legitimate to train the other frequency ranges, but I stopped doing that a long time ago. I actually found that infralow has much more powerful and lasting effects, and it doesn't take as long to get to where you need to go. So it was, I don't know, we could go in all kinds of convoluted directions as to how we got there and what I think might have been behind all of that. I wrote about that a little bit in Primal Body, Primal Mind. But however it was that we were driven to go in that direction, we're there now. And it's astonishingly powerful. And so, neurofeedback is a process by which you're basically giving your brain, well, I didn't get to finish how the actual setup works, right? We got off on a tangent a little bit with brain frequencies, but when I set the goal for somebody's brain training, what the person sitting in the chair with the electrodes on their head sees then is a display in front of them, a video screen in which some sort of video game is happening, or maybe it's just a video. It could just be like a movie or something playing on the screen. However, the visual feedback coming off of that screen and the sound and whatever else are actually being modulated by their own brainwave activity. So the person is actually getting a ton of feedback, or their brain is actually getting a ton of feedback as to what is happening with their brain in the moment. And the brain is one of the most narcissistic entities in the universe. It adores seeing information about itself, and it goes, "Ooh, that's me." And the brain it latches onto that almost instantly and just sort of pays attention. And it's a little bit like, neurofeedback is like a form of biofeedback. Traditional biofeedback is largely focused on things like what we in the field call peripheral measures. So breathing, heart rate, galvanic skin response, heart rate variability, skin temperature and things like that. And say, for instance, you go to traditional kind of biofeedback therapist and you've got migraines and whatever else, they might hand you a little thermometer that you hold in your hand, and they say, okay, now focus on raising your skin temperature. So you focus and focus and focus. And with any luck, your brain figures out a way to increase your skin temperature, which is in effect eliciting a parasympathetic response, which then dilates your peripheral blood vessels and puts you in more of a state of an autonomic parasympathetic state where you feel more relaxed and calm, and the blood vessels open up, and the migraine went away.
I want to speak into that a little bit. Like,
okay.
what we're doing there, that's what we call interoception, which is where we can actually sense and affect our parasympathetic nervous system, which is supposed to be our autonomic nervous system, right? Which is supposed to be not under our volitional control. But as you're saying, with biofeedback, we're able to do that. Right. And I mean, we don't even need biofeedback to do that. It's something that we have the ability to do. Like Wim Hof is a master at this. He's the Iceman. He'll like get in below freezing temperatures for hours, and his core body temperature doesn't change. And he teaches others how to do this. Right. And it's really cool to see all these things that we can do and that are not in the textbooks, the physiology textbooks, and which are years old, honestly.
Sure. Well, and the basis behind the concept of biofeedback, is basically predicated on the idea that any autonomic function that you can become consciously aware of, you can learn to control or manipulate in some meaningful way. However, with neurofeedback, you're dealing directly with the electrical activity in the brain. And as such, the feedback is happening way faster than the conscious mind can actually process. In other words, the conscious mind, which probably actually is the most narcissistic entity in the universe, it likes to think it's running the show. It has very little to do with what's actually running the show. But the conscious mind is not necessarily privy to the process. The conscious mind is sitting there watching the nifty little spaceships flying on the screen, or Pac-Man eating the dots, or whatever the display happens to be, or maybe just into watching Shrek or something, because we can actually run the software through videos, and then as the person watches the film and they're just sort of caught up in the film, there are all sorts of subtle cues that are manipulating the way the video is playing and the way it sounds, that notify the brain of shifts in its own functioning. And so So basically the process, if I want to put it in a nutshell, is all about giving the brain information about its own functioning so that it effectively can better regulate its own states.
Mm-hmm.
And, we've all walked out of the house one day or another with, say, hair sticking up funny, or, toilet paper stuck to the bottom of your shoe, or the skirt tucked in the back of the pantyhose, or, well, maybe not you, but then again, I don't know. I don't judge. But at any rate, and we may be walking around thinking we're perfectly fine. We're not aware that there's anything necessarily wrong. People are looking at us funny, but whatever. It's kind of drafty, but whatever. And then we walk into a public restroom and we look in the mirror and we say, holy crap. You see suddenly what's going on. And what is our immediate instinct? We reach up, this thing sticking up and your hair sticking up funny. You're going to smooth it back, right? And it's just an automatic reaction. Nobody had to tell you to do it. Nobody had to tell you how to do it. You just know to do it. And it's but say, for instance, you walk in, your hair's doing okay. And you look in the mirror and say, hey, looking good, and then you walk out and the toilet paper's trailing behind you on your shoe because the mirror wasn't quite pointed in the right direction, right? Or maybe the lighting wasn't quite right, or the angle.
Mm-hmm.
And so the job of the neurofeedback provider is to make sure that the brain is getting the appropriate information that it needs in order to be able to do what it needs to do. And there may be several different placements that get employed during the course of a particular session. But it is within a few seconds, the brain sees itself, says, holy crap, I had no idea I was doing that, and it adjusts itself relative to the information it's being given. If it's the wrong information, then the adjustment may not feel right, and the person will know that rather quickly, oftentimes. I mean, I've made an adjustment of literally 1/10,000th of 1 hertz within a session, all the time I do that. If I see somebody's not responding, I can tell from their body language, or they're reporting some level of discomfort, I can make the most minor adjustment and suddenly they'll go, whoa, did you just do something? Because I feel really different. That is how exquisitely sensitive the brain is.
So what do you mean by a small adjustment? Small adjustment to what's being received?
No, an adjustment in terms of where I'm asking the brain to be. I'm giving the brain feedback about where it is. And I'm asking, so here's another analogy I'll use. Say, for instance, you've got, maybe you were diagnosed, your doctor diagnoses you with a cardiovascular condition or something. And it says, you got to go and start doing some exercise, right, to get better. So you go to the friendly neighborhood gym, and hopefully you find a qualified personal trainer that can set you up on a program that's going to be appropriate for your needs. And based on your age, weight, fitness level, and things, there is an educated guess made about what kind of program might be appropriate for you. And so say they start you out on a treadmill, right? Again, based on a number of factors that you provide them with information about, again, your age, weight, fitness level, etc. They're going to kind of start you out at a certain pace on that thing and see how you do. And if that pace is too fast, obviously that's a little counterproductive. If it's too slow, it's counterproductive. So the goal of the trainer is to help you kind of find that zone. Mm-hmm. Where you are jogging along on the tread, or moving or walking, or whatever pace you're at. And, the point is not, of course, it's not a perfect analogy because it's not a feedback thing exactly, but you're being asked to exercise within a certain range, right, of activity, which is the analogy to be made. And in the case of the treadmill, you're being asked to increase your heart rate to a certain level. But the goal for that is not to prescribe a certain level of heart rate activity so that your heart can race all day long after you leave the gym. You're not training your heart to race all day long. You're exercising your heart and lungs within a certain range of activity so that now when you leave the gym, if it was a good range, you feel a little better, a little stronger, you adapt to that, you have a greater flexibility to be able to move, to be able to withstand a greater variety of challenges perhaps imposed upon you.
Right.
And over time, that frequency or that range or that pace that you're exercising on may change and adjust a little bit, and the range of optimization may change a bit. But the ultimate goal is to improve your resilience, your robustness, your capacity to handle a wider variety of challenges. And, and by golly, my heart's doing a little better, but gosh, I lost a few pounds and I feel a little clearer headed and I, this, that, and the other thing, all the other benefits that come with exercise. So there's an exercise model with respect to neurofeedback, and these frequency ranges are similar to the pace that you would set on a treadmill for somebody trying to exercise their heart, right?
Gotcha. So we call that the therapeutic zone, the zone where it's actually it's giving benefit. It's stressing you, but it's beneficial stress,
Right.
It's not too much, it's not too little.
Stress. In the case of neurofeedback, we're not shoving the brain, we're not trying to force the brain to do anything strenuous.
Okay.
In many cases, actually, we're winding it down, as a matter of fact, because the vast majority of people actually don't suffer from underarousal, they suffer from overarousal. And they may experience underarousal as a result. I sometimes call it anxiety to exhaustion, where the brain is just so overwhelmed all the time, it sort of shuts down. And by helping a person learn how to take the pedal off the gas, and anybody suffering, more to the point, a TBI, is going to tend to have a much higher level of excessive, sympathetic activity, right? Inflammation tends to provoke excessive sympathetic activity, that flight or fight response, and that makes you anxious, and the anxiety then adds to the pain and dysfunction and and all kinds of things, and inflammation for that matter, and it becomes a vicious cycle. What neurofeedback is able to do is go in and basically calm that response way, way, way down. It's where the brain actually finds its more kind of calm-centered parasympathetic place. And you're retraining the brain to function in a more optimized, usually parasympathetic state, but, in a state that is more functional in their lives. It's more, it allows them to operate with a much greater sense of centeredness and ability to handle a greater variety of challenges imposed. Where a person may be felt overwhelmed and anxious all the time, they find that they're actually functioning at a much more even keel that allows them to move in any direction that they may need to go relative to what's appropriate, right? And that's the ultimate goal, is to restore that place of flexibility in your brain's function that allow it to move from state to state relative to what's appropriate, as opposed to being constantly caught in a feedback loop all the time of a particular type of function. I mean, what I have found more often than not with a population that I've worked with over more than 20 years is that people have a tendency to be kind of trapped in their own nervous system, right? And are sort of a victim of that. The average person that may seem, either really out of it or really difficult or whatever else, I see that person as basically being fundamentally a prisoner in their own nervous systems. And rather than judging them for being the way they are, which is kind of human nature with people who just don't get it, the kind of people that many of us might take a step or two back from when they walk into a room, it's like, whoa, I cannot handle this person for whatever reason. I'm looking at and I'm going, oh man, I'm thinking of what it is, how it is they're wired, and what it is I would need to do with respect to what, the application of that tool, for instance, and in addition to the other tools I employ in order to help that person, and, of course, if I'm driving down the road, minding my own business, and somebody passes me at 95 miles an hour, cuts me off and gives me the finger, I'd be lying a little bit if I wasn't thinking the word asshole or whatever. But that said,
you're like, oh, bless your heart.
but really the cogs I mean, that's just kind of a knee-jerk response, but really the cogs are turning, and I'm thinking,
Yes.
and I know exactly where to put the electrodes there.
That's amazing.
That's
Yeah.
where my mind goes with that.
And I really appreciate that, instead of going to a judging place, it's more like understanding that like that person is neurologically, wired in a certain way and could really use
Right. That's
some help
counterproductive, right?
rewiring, because that's what it comes down to, is rewiring our neurology in order to build that resilience, that neurological resilience and adaptability.
Mm-hmm.
And we call it being anti-fragile, being just able to handle things, resilient, yeah. And I see that all the time. So what do you usually see with brain injury patients?
Well, what I know is happening, and what I certainly see is that by and large, they tend to be in a state of chronic, sympathetic overdrive. Very oftentimes are in a state of fundamental neurological instability, where just small perturbations, one direction or the other, will tend to shove them off in big directions that may not be desirable. Um, the thing about head injury is the most important thing as a neurofeedback provider that needs to be ferreted out is who was the person before the head injury, right? Who were they, and where were their strengths and weaknesses then? The thing about head injury is that it will tend to shove us off of whatever cliff we happen to be standing next to. And so if you ever had an inherent susceptibility to migraines or panic attacks or mood lability or whatever else, you'll have that in spades now that you've had that blow to the head, right? It has a tendency to kind of drive you there. Very frequently, of course, you have things like anxiety and depression as comorbidities with it, which makes sense when you understand the nature of head injury and the inflammatory response, and also the compromise, the inevitable compromise to the blood-brain barrier that occurs as a result of head injury, that can lead to a chronic inflammatory response that may be very difficult to wind down on its own. Now, working with neurofeedback, we're actually going to those overactive glia and we're asking them to calm down. But if you're not also employing sorts of things that additionally trigger microglia, like antigen response, in other words, exposure to things like gluten,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, which ought to be a given, lose the gluten yesterday. I don't care who you are. There's no one for whom gluten is beneficial. It's far more likely to compromise than benefit you in any way. And actually, you don't have to have an immune reactivity to it in order for it to damage your gut and damage your brain. And in fact, all gluten consumption results in the elicitation of a particular enzyme called zonulin, which controls not only your gut permeability, but also your blood-brain barrier permeability.
Mm.
So anything you can do to avoid that is going to put you ahead of the curve in terms of helping you to recover from your injuries,
Mm-hmm.
with a lot less difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
Gluten is always going to get in the way, always.
Absolutely. I really appreciate.
Blood sugar problems. That's another foundational issue that if you had them before, boy, you're really going to have issues with that now. Frankly, I make a case for taking blood sugar out of the mood, cognitive, and energy equation by replacing the reliance on glucose for brain function on something called ketones. And I've been talking about this publicly since 2009, and certainly before then in my practice. Now it's all the rage. Everybody's talking about it, but I was the first person within the ancestral health genre to actually talk about this, and the importance of coming to rely on ketones as a primary source of brain fuel, as opposed to glucose, if you truly want the best, most reliable, and most stabilized brain function you can possibly have. And, and that helps to minimize inflammatory response, helps to minimize the free radical activity that occurs as a result of brain injury, can help the brain function far more efficiently in a state of hypoxia, which is another issue with brain injury, is blood flow to different areas. You can radically improve your blood flow. I believe 38% improved blood flow to the brain in a state of effective ketogenic adaptation, which is remarkable in anybody, and that's in normal individuals. And on and on and on. I mean, there are nearly all benefits, and I can't think of a single drawback except for the process of adaptation, which may be more challenging for some than others.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually in the process of, like any day now, getting ready to release an online program I'm calling the Primal Plan. I'm trying to divest myself of the kind of the mainstream, terms like keto and paleo, which have come to mean something different to everybody claiming to practice them. I'm tired of having to try to fit myself like a square peg into a round hole to describe these things. And instead I created my own terminology, and a term I chose is primalgenic, which was for me a way of taking control of the definition of what I do in a way that isn't going to mean anything other than the meaning I give it. I literally have trademarked that term legally. So that, anyway, it means a variety of things, but it's a highly uncompromising approach to optimizing both brain and physical health in a way that is somewhat unique within these genres. And there isn't a whole bunch of hype associated with that. This takes not only I've often said that the sort of selective pressures that we faced as an early evolving species in terms of what kinds of foods would have been most commonly available to us would have certainly helped to shape our basic physiological makeup and our most basic nutritional requirements. And to me, that's the only rational starting place. So that's sort of the paleo primal component, if you will, but it's only a starting place. Mm-hmm. We can't necessarily extrapolate from that to say, well, just because our ancestors did something, it's a good enough reason for us to do the same thing today. I don't think that that's a rational assumption. That just because we were able to put something in our mouths, chew it up and swallow it and not drop dead, doesn't mean that a particular food was necessarily optimal for them, much less would it be optimal for us. So how would we know? How do we know how to optimize those basic evolutionary principles? Well, that's where I bring in things like human longevity research as a way of better optimizing those principles for, not necessarily for living forever. It's not about, living 175 years. Anything that enhances longevity in these research models basically is doing so by minimizing the potential for disease. And that's the idea behind this, is to optimize these principles in a way that can better optimize health and hopefully longevity if you live long enough. But I could get hit by a bus, later today, or something. The idea isn't living forever. The idea is quality of life in the process. I don't want to be, 120 years old if it means I'm hooked up to oxygen tanks and I don't recognize my family, friends, and loved ones. And I can't, I don't have any quality of life. Mm-hmm. So, and the other thing that I do that is, somewhat unique within the genre is I automatically take into account the exploding rates. Well, for starters, I take into account the uniquely challenging world, and I believe uniquely toxic and hostile world that we live in today, as opposed to, during our earlier evolutionary sojourn, if you will. And so, there are things that we have to take into account and compensate for that our prehistoric ancestors could never have even begun to fathom. Mm-hmm. And I'm really looking at when I talk about the primal aspect of things, I'm really looking at kind of like core foundational prehistoric evolutionary considerations. And I'm not so much looking at, well, what did Native American cultures do? What did the people do that Weston Price studied? I mean, there's a lot of valid information in that. I'm actually on the board of the Price Pottinger Nutrition Foundation, and I'm passionate about the work of a lot of these nutritional pioneers, but they were really looking at Neolithic cultures. And the thing that we forget is how different the world was during the better part of our evolutionary journey. And so I really try to dig back as deeply as I can in order to really get at the things that shaped us in the first place, and not just how we adapted to conditions following the end of the last ice age, because things are really different for us since then.
Especially in the past, even 100 years, like it's just been a huge shifts. But yeah, looking at the word primal and the word primary, right? Like it's very much like where we came from originally, what we have evolved with for the vast majority of our existence on this planet.
That's why I chose the word primal in my material. Now, there are other people within the so-called paleo genre using the term primal, and I have no idea why they're using it. Maybe it's just for them, it was another way of distinguishing themselves from the marketing crowd. I don't know. You'd have to ask them. It doesn't, the term primal doesn't really have a meaning, a literal meaning that's separate from paleo or whatever else. But I chose it because of that. It to me it elicited a sense of something much older and much more primary, right? Much more foundational, and that's why I made the choice of that term. And so it's there are different reasons for using these terms, but those are the reasons I used to choose the term primal, which I think I was the first person in the ancestral health genre to use that term. It's just it's being used by like everyone and their dog or cat right now. And so I'm trying to kind of distinguish myself a little bit from what everybody else is doing, because I think it's quite different. And
I'll agree, and everything like I was at your place in the last month or something, oh man, some of the best meal I've had in a long time. It was amazing. Always just can always count on the food being fantastic.
Pretty pristine, yeah.
It's like it's the best of the best. And
you don't have to suffer to eat this way.
No, you definitely don't. It's not. There is no like, what's the word? Like
feelings of deprivation and all.
There's absolutely none of that. It feels so like
I feel like I'm getting away with stuff,
Yeah, I know. Like, every cell in your body is just like, yes, it's awesome. And I wanted to rewind back to where you said the inevitable breach of the blood-brain barrier after a brain injury, and that's huge. That's like, if you injure your brain, your blood-brain barrier is like, it got injured too, which means any toxins in your body are able to cross the blood-brain barrier and enter your brain.
And affect their response, right?
Which is where I was like, okay, like after my injury, when I learned this, I was like, okay, I need to eliminate all exposure to toxins, which is food first off, and we have lots of control over the food we eat. So that's again why I wrote How to Brain. But then the air we breathe, like we have less control over that besides choosing not to smoke.
Well, you can get a high quality air purifier for your home and all that kind of thing. That's there are lots of things.
There are things.
In one of the things I'm fond of saying is that in the face of so many things that we seemingly can't control, it's incumbent upon us to take control of what we can.
Yes.
And there's a large number of things that we can still do, steps that we can take to control our exposure to toxins in our air, water, and food supply,
Right.
And
Right.
a lot of it takes recognizing the fact that nobody's coming to save us. We're kind of the ones we've been waiting for. We need to be willing to take a look at what's going on around us and understand what steps we need to take in order to compensate for that. Another
Absolutely.
really important point to make is that we as creatures that evolved in the wild, we're really wired for being alert to what I call tangible threats. Like, say, for instance, a saber-toothed cat jumps out from behind a rock and starts chasing you around. Well, that's pretty tangible, or suddenly you're getting charged by a cantankerous woolly mammoth, fairly tangible. Or there is a major storm, or there's a warring tribe coming into camp, or say there's a volcanic eruption, or major climate change, or uh, you know seismic activity, or even something like a famine. All of these things are stimuli, if you will, that we are wired to pay attention to and to recognize as a threat that we need to take action in order to protect ourselves against. That's how we're wired. That's how every wild thing is wired. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the environment that we live in today, the climate controlled environments where it's always 72 degrees, it's like, I don't give a rat's behind if you're in Minnesota in February where it's, it may be 40 below zero outside, but that's not where you're at. You're sitting, on your nice comfy couch where it's 72 degrees and, noshing on, cheesy doodles and watching Dancing with the Stars or something, that we also don't have to take more than a step or two in any given direction to be able to grab a handful of something we call food without really even knowing what's in it and shove it into our faces and call it good, right? And the thing is that 99% of what actually threatens our very survival, not just as individuals, but as a species today, lies in those things that are actually invisible to us. So again, contaminants in our air, water, and food supply, EMF, radiation contamination, GMOs, we can go on, and I could be a total buzzkill at parties, and I go into all of the things that we're dealing with that our prehistoric ancestors wouldn't have even begun to have fathomed, much less known how to wrap themselves around. I mean, they wouldn't have had any reason to have to be alert to these things because a lot of these challenges just weren't a going concern for them.
Mm-hmm.
And yet those are the things that actually threaten our very survival and well-being. And so, but we're not wired for thinking those things are very important. And even when somebody like me right now, I'm bringing this stuff to your attention, there are a lot of people that are going to go, yeah, whatever. I'm, just, let me watch my Netflix and I would rather not think about it. And if we can't see the threat, we're wired to just not care that much. Mm-hmm. But we need to make conscious choices and decisions about and develop a conscious awareness around these things so that we can, in fact, take the steps necessary in order to protect ourselves from those exposures in a way, because frankly, we really don't have any wiggle room anymore. We don't have, one of the other things that we're being compromised by is our genome. It's been compromised over multiple generations of exposures to many of these things that have made us all much more vulnerable to what's out there. Mm-hmm. And so it's one of those things where we don't have anywhere near the wiggle room that our, great grandparents, our grandparents, even our parents had against all of these newfangled selective pressures that are basically selecting us out of existence today, and much less our prehistoric ancestors. They had a lot more wiggle room. They could consume things that were a little bit compromising to them. They could nosh on, once they developed the ability to generate fire at will, they could nosh on all kinds of starchy tubers that they, superheated and, whatever over time. Our early ancestors didn't eat starch, and they really didn't eat a lot of, sugary foods, but they had a higher tolerance for potential compromises to their well-being because so much else was pristine in terms of their diet and their air, the quality of their air, water, and food supply.
Resilience.
Just don't have that wiggle room.
They were extremely resilient. They were very anti-fragile. They were given an environment where they weren't constantly bombarded with things that were chipping away bit by bit on
Right.
on everything. And so yeah, I mean I hear what you're saying, like
Right.
with all this, it is kind of a buzzkill. It's like, hey, things aren't great and there's so much we can do. That's what's the empowerment. Like after my injury, I've gotten to the point where I'm totally stoked that I had this entire experience, because I know so much more about well, about life, about death, about what we are, who we are, and how we can, do so much to free ourselves from this, environment that's created around us. So, for example, we're talking about the blood-brain barrier and the breach, and after a brain injury, and I'm eliminating toxins, including skin, like everything I'm putting on my skin, like brushing my teeth, things of that sort. I started making my own tooth powder. I started making my own deodorant, and aspects, just taking control of what we can take control of. And I really, really appreciate that. And empower yourself. It's like, it's not even like everything's terrible and there's nothing we can do. Everything's the way it is, and there is so much we can do when we're knowledgeable about it.
We need to take that information as a source of empowerment and not disempowerment. And it's very easy to go into a state of despair and helplessness and hopelessness, which is, I guess what the powers that be would like to have us do. Turn CNN the hell off, stay away from the things that serve no useful purpose and stressing you out. But it is really important to pay attention to the things that we can take control of in our day-to-day lives and our environment, and recognize that we all have to become activists if we want to secure any hope of improving the conditions that are. It's not just adapting to the conditions that are, but also finding ways of taking some responsibility for the way things are, and taking the necessary steps in order to address that. I gave a talk at Montana State University last summer, and you can, if you type in Nora Gedgaudas, Montana State University, or AHS18. I need to maybe figure out exactly how to do that in YouTube, but it'll get you there. I mean, you can watch that talk free of charge. It basically speaks to, what are these forces? What are the current selective pressures? Politically, economically, those are the primary pressures. Not so much anymore a hostile physical environment in terms of, predators, four-legged predators anyway, that want to eat us, or exposure to the elements and things like that. We're really looking at a situation where the forces that are manipulating our our health and well-being in this world have certain economic and power-related agendas that have nothing to do with your best interests whatsoever. And the media is completely controlled by those forces, all of it. In fact, academia is largely controlled by those forces. Education is largely controlled by those forces now. And so we really kind of have to be, one of the things that I do in my approach is I take a very common sense, in addition to looking at a lot of independent peer-reviewed science, which is as rare today as moon dust.
Right.
Most of it's industry-driven, so-called science. And basically using that, but also cross-pollinating that with let's take a look at our, the foundations of our evolutionary and genetic heritage. Let's take a look at, our anatomy and physiology, which is another thing that I take into account. Surprise, that those things matter. You have a lot of people saying, well, everybody's different, and therefore some people should eat a vegetarian diet and some people could eat high meat and all this kind of thing. No. The thing is that what defines us as a species are not our differences, but those things that we share in common.
We have
yes,
a
we may
whole
have
lot in common.
we all may have different fingerprints, but we all have fingers. And we kind of have to start with those foundational concepts in order to understand that we're much more alike physiologically than unalike. And we all have a hydrochloric acid-based digestive system. There's nobody that I've met with 4 stomachs or a fermentative-based digestive system that can optimize what they extract from plant foods in a way that will totally give them everything they need in order to be optimally healthy. There is no such thing. There's no basis for this anywhere in the fossil record. There's no basis for this at all in human anatomy and physiology. So we have to really take an honest look at how we're actually designed and eat things that are most in alignment with that design, and take into account the uniquely toxic world that we live in today, figure out how to compensate for that. And it takes steps that our prehistoric ancestors didn't have to take. And, all of this is ultimately foundational to what it takes to build and rebuild a better brain if it's been compromised in some way.
There it is. The supplies for the brain,
right?
Supplies for the body. It's all feeding the cells the nutrients that they need to function optimally, because what we are, this hardware that we are made up of, this vessel that we inhabit, it is so good at repairing itself when it's given the opportunity and the ingredients and the instructions to do so. And the instructions would be the neurofeedback, the therapy, the targeted therapy, the things that rebuild neural pathways in the way that we want them to. Yeah. So we're running out of time here, but I want to just kind of like tie it up in a little bow. We talked about how neurofeedback, what neurofeedback is, how it's basically training the brain to be in a certain therapeutic zone that the practitioner kind of like plays with and figures out. And as you said, you can adjust just a tiny bit and make huge differences. And then we want to get the supplies there as well. And that's where the nutrition aspect comes in. And me and you are absolutely on the same page when it comes to nutrition. I absolutely love everything. Your food is just pristine, all the way down the line. I allow more wiggle room. You are like the best, and I respect and I
figure
Go ahead. Best of the best. It's the way to go. Why not?
It's the kind of thing where, look, I take a very uncompromising approach because we are compromised to such an extreme.
Yes.
I'm not the one being extreme. What's extreme is the environment that we live in today and the degree to which we have been compromised. And it may take steps that some people look upon as extreme in order to restore some semblance of health, much less any hope of optimized health. So I don't know, the old adage of everything in moderation, that's another one of those just make me crazy. The old everybody's different and everything in moderation. Don't get started, man, because
it's a cop out to me. All of it's a cop out. It's like that's politics. Not the case.
It's politics, right?
Yeah.
Or the idea of so-called metabolic flexibility, that's a made-up term, we're designed to run on one fuel or another as a primary source of fuel. And if you want to adapt to a state of effective ketogenic adaptation, you want to, change your metabolism over to relying on, diesel instead of rocket fuel, is something that's going to be more reliable and something that will stabilize your brain and protect it. it takes a few weeks to arrive at that effective state of adaptation.
Yep.
You're not going to go to a place where you can just sort of swing back and forth with whatever it is you feel like eating and then have whatever primary metabolism you want. What you're going to have is extreme inefficiency if you try to swing back and forth like that. It's not optimal. So, I make the case for making these metabolic changes as a lifestyle change and not as just sort of like some sort of temporary thing that's fun to do to lose a few pounds or whatever. The more that we can rely on fat as our primary source of fuel and the less we rely on glucose, the longer we're going to live, the healthier we're going to be by far, the more free from disease we're going to be by far and premature aging, and the more stable and robust our brain function is going to be by far. And so, the degree to which we choose to relax and compromise that is a degree to which we're compromising the very thing that is there to, that give our lives meaning and to be able to, the health of your brain is the health of your quality of life.
There it is.
And if you're compromising it by whatever it is you're choosing to indulge in, well, those chickens are going to come home to roost. Nobody gets a free pass on this stuff anymore. Not in today's world.
Absolutely. And indulge. There are consequences to that indulgement.
Right.
So, it's always so good to chat with you, Nora. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Where can people learn more about you?
Well, I'm doing a lot right now with online education. And so I have a website called primalcourses.com. And I have a year-long 52-week certification course. I'd say 80% of the people enrolled in that are doctors and naturopaths and chiropractors and also nutritionists, health coaches, and things like that. But also a significant percentage of people that are just regular, everyday people that want to have more in-depth understanding of the machine in which they inhabit and how to best optimize that. And so really quite a lot of people are taking the course that just want to get more out of what they've already gotten from my materials. And so there's that. I also have my new Primalgenic plan program is going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks. I'm hoping, certainly I'm hoping before the end of this month, before the end of September. And it's called the Primalgenic Plan, a 3-week meal by meal total health transformation program. And it comes with all the hand holding and ways of understanding how to adopt this way of eating in a way that can better optimize your health and give you greater resilience from disease and dysfunction. I also have my regular website, Primal Body -primalmind.com. And I actually used to have my own radio show, and those podcasts are available. Those episodes are available for free through my website. I have a lot of articles, other information, lots of free stuff. And let's see, I have also my books, Primal Body, Primal Mind. And I just happen to have this here, my most recent book, Primal Fat Burner, all of which you can get in most of the bookstores or many bookstores, and of course through Amazon. And if you go through my Primal Body, Primal Mind website and click on the link to my books through there, I might get a slight extra kickback, which I always appreciate. But just get the books however you can. There's information. There's a lot more information. Those books were not written from the standpoint of wanting to market to you, to sell you a bunch of stuff. Really, if I wanted to do that, Primal Body, Primal Mind would have been 10 books instead of just one, and Primal Fat Burner too. Just an enormous amount of highly actionable, practical information anybody can apply to radically improve the quality of their health. So there we go.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nora.
You're so
always a pleasure. So there it is. You see what I'm saying? Her and I can talk for for hours. We've spent entire nights just talking. We hardly scratch the surface every time, and it's always good. And Nora is just she's brilliant, and her uncompromising attitude. There's something to be said for that. I know that I say the healthiest thing we can do for our brain, bodies, and souls is to enjoy our life and to do so sustainably. Nora's in the camp of like, if we're going to do so sustainably, it needs to be uncompromising. And there's something to be said for that. If you want optimal health, she's your lady. She's awesome. And Primalgenic, I mean, it's the best. It's the best food. It's the best. I mean, it's uncompromising. It's the best of the best of the best. So check out her work, and thank you guys again for being here. Thank you for being a part of this podcast, for being a part of what I'm doing. If you're not on my email list yet, head over to feedabrain.com. Get the fat handout. That handout's awesome, and we talked a lot about fat in this episode, and that is healthy fat. That will steer you towards healthy fats and the right cooking temperature to keep it below, in order to make sure that the fats stay healthy. Because if you heat them too much, then they oxidize. So yeah, pick that up. Join my mailing list, and let's be in touch. And if you feel like supporting this podcast, head over to patreon.com/AIBI for Adventures in Brain Injury. And throw me $1 or $2 per episode. It helps a whole lot. Anyways, I appreciate you guys. I hope you guys are having an awesome day. And I am stoked to see you next time. See you later.
Someone take me to a doctor.